Welcome back to Sampstra Games, the place to find new strategy games, and welcome to my guide on Field of Glory 2 Medieval. Today we're going to talk about terrain. Now first I have to say that I have the Reconquista DLC, so if you notice any unit or terrain that you're not familiar with, it's because it's part of the DLC. Secondly, if I use any terms that you're not familiar with or that makes you a little bit confused, I have plenty of other guides about this game, so there will be a playlist below that you can check it out. Now let's focus on this guide. So first of all, I'm going to walk you through the types of terrains that this game have. Then I'm going to talk to you about what the terrain affects. So we'll start with movement, then we'll focus on unit state, and finally we'll focus on combat and other effects. Now let's start with type of terrains. There are 4 types of terrains: difficult, rough, non-open, and open. Some examples of difficult terrains are marsh, like these hexes over here, woods, and then difficult slopes. An example of a rough terrain are rough ground, like this over here, or built-up area, like this over here. An example of not open terrain are enclosures, as you can see, for example, here. An example of open terrain is regular ground. Now this is just grass here, but you might also have a frozen ground or deserts and things like that. Now, fifth type of terrain that we're not going to focus on here too much is impassable terrain. An example of that are mountains and cliffs that are impassable to all troops, and big enough water squares that can be impassable to land troops. Now, the type of terrain is important because oftentimes I'm going to tell you effects, like I'll tell you that difficult terrains causes this or that. However, there is certain merit to knowing exactly what type of terrains it is, because sometimes the specific one affects things as well. Now, how do you know what type of unit it is? Well, if you have the detailed tooltips, all you have to do is hover over a specific hex. For example, here I can see this is marsh, difficult terrain. Okay, or here I can see rough ground, rough terrain, and etc. Now let's talk about what the terrain affects. So we'll start off by talking about movement. Now I'm going to give you a quick refresher on how movement works, but if you want to know more details, there's a guide for it below. So if you click on a unit, you can see their action points here on the left bottom. Here we can see 10 out of 10. And you pay action points to turn and to move. So if we jump over to this light unit, you can see how much it can move forward. Typically, one move forward costs 4. You can see it over here, move unit 4 out of 10. If you try to move diagonally, it will cost 6. So one move to open terrain is 4, diagonally is 6. If I try to do the same thing with this unit, and I'm going to hover over this, you might expect to see 6, but this says 10. Why? Because some unit have to pay for turns. So light troops do not have to pay action points to turn, but others do. So this unit has to pay to turn, so that's why it costs 10. Now, movement to more difficult terrains than open is a little bit more expensive. Now, some of you might be expecting to see a table right now. It's going to tell you that movement to difficult terrain costs this or thing, or movement to rough terrain costs this amount of action points. The problem is that it's not quite how that works, because it's different for different units. Let me give you an example. For this raw spearman, movement to open ground costs you 4, and then movement into the woods costs you additional 6. So essentially, moving through difficult terrain costs 6 for this raw spearman. However, if we look at these peasants, even though they're in difficult terrains, it only costs them 4 to move through. Now these armored spearmen, also for them it costs 6 to move through difficult terrain. So it's really important to note that it's different for different type of a unit. The important thing is that it really depends on a unit. However, there are certain rules that you can learn that will really help you out. For example, if you look at mountain units, for example, these city knights and sergeant, movement into woods costs them 8 action points, but they only have 12 action points total. And this is true for most mountain units, that they will not be able to move through woods very well. Essentially, the majority of mountain units can only move 1 hex into the woods. This is really important. Why? Because the same rules that apply for movement also apply for evasion and pursuit. Let's say an enemy has a unit over here up on these tracks, okay? And I'm trying to attack them. Well, the enemy is going to be able to evade through the woods easily, just like we saw, for example, with the light archers. They can easily run through this. It's not a problem for them. But the mounted units was only going to be able to step 1 hex into the wood, so they will use all up their action points to move that 1 hex, but the unit that's running away will be able to move 2, 3, or 4 hexes away, for example. This can be a really good tactic to utilize in the enemy if you know the type of unit that the enemy has. Now that we've talked about movement, let's talk about some other effects that terrain has. Certain terrains can cause a unit to be disordered. What's important here to note is that disordered and disrupted are not the same thing. If you're like me and you played this game for the very first time, you might thought, oh, this is the same thing. It's not the same thing. Disrupted is a level of morale. Disordered is a state of a unit. It's two completely different things, okay? Now, if you hover over a hex, for example, here on this marsh, you can see, if you have detailed tooltips like I do, that it says severely disorders mounted, elephant, and heavy foot, and disorders other except light foot. So, for example, here I have crossbowmen who are bowmen and they're not light foot, so you can see that they're moderately disordered. There are essentially two types of disordered: severely or moderately disordered and regularly disordered. Now, let me talk to you about what disordered affects. There's something called point of advantage, and this is how the game determines who has the upper hand in combat. The result of combat will then cause losses, but more importantly, it will cause a cohesion test, so you can learn more about it in my other guides. But essentially, there's like you measure strength between the two units, and then the points of advantages which decide who has the upper hand and who's more likely to win the fight. And these point of advantages are dependent on different types of unit and etc. Just an example of a point of advantage is if you're shooting with an artillery, it will get plus 100 points of advantages, but not if it's fragmented or severely disordered. So you will essentially lose some of these points of advantages. In practice, it means that the unit will just be weaker in combat. Another thing that disorder affects is cohesion tests. So I have a guide on cohesion tests below, but let me just quickly a quick rundown. Essentially, you roll dice. If you get 6 or above, you keep your level. If you get below 6, you lose your level. So for example, if you were steady, you were attacked, and you rolled a 5, you end up losing a morale level, so you jump to disrupted. Now there are some rerolls, but again, I don't want to go into details over here. But what's important is that after you roll, there are a lot of modifiers applied. And one of the modifiers is that if you are severely disordered, you will get a negative modifier, so you get less of a number. Now this doesn't seem like much, but it actually can be a pretty huge deal. If a unit is disordered due to terrain, how do you get rid of it? It's actually quite simple. You just step out of the terrain. So for example, if I have these crossbowmen here that are moderately disordered, all I have to do is move them here, and now they're back to being steady. Terrain is not the only thing that can cause a unit to be disordered. There are certain types of units that if they're adjacent to each other, they might cause some other unit to be disordered. For example, cavalry will be disordered if they're next to enemy cavalry, and etc. Lastly, the disordering effect also applies when you're evading or pursuing. So essentially, if I attack a unit and they run through the disordered terrain, and then in the disordered terrain we catch up and the combat begin, the effects of being disordered are applied because we're currently in disordered terrain. Okay? Now, there's another unit state that terrain can cause, and that's essentially being hidden. What does this mean? That the unit will be able to ambush. So, as you're gonna see, there are a lot of these question marks here. And what this means that if a unit is there, it might be hidden from me, and then it can cause an ambush. Infantry can ambush in woods, built-up areas, and any troop can ambush out of sight behind high ground, trees, or built-up areas. So for example, any troop can do an ambush if it's out of sight and in this built-up area, and then infantry can also do an ambush if it's not out of sight, but if it's like hidden in the woods, for example, in here. Now there are some other things terrain can give you, and these are combat bonuses. For example, a high ground. And the way the high ground is calculated is essentially a difference between the level of the ground that you have and the level of the ground that the enemy have, and you might be able to get a bonus there for your attack. So again, this will increase the point of advantages for your attack. Now here you can see height, so you can see that height is 100, and this enemy here is, for example, on height 0, 0. If it's 0, then it's not written. So if I'm attacking from here to there, I'm going to get a bonus from the high ground. And another effect that terrain can give you is cover. So again, if you hover over here, you might see that the marsh gives you 10% cover to a unit that's not moving and 0% cover to a unit that's moving through. Also, another important thing is, for example, enclosure. So this is an enclosure and it has an obstacle, which means that the foot unit, if it's a foot unit that's there, it will get protection versus flank and rear charges and cavalry, plus it will also gain combat advantage. Another important thing about fortifications is that obviously if you're building a fortification, the negative effects of the fortification only applies to the enemy and not to you. So if a unit is standing in fortification, it's being treated as if it was open terrain, and then it gives the units bonuses like protection. But for the enemy, if they try to kind of run into it, or it would give them the negative effect. Now, another important point here is about close combat on the edge of terrain. So if my unit is here and the enemy unit is here, if I attack them, I will get the negative effect of this disordered terrain, but if they attack me, I do not. So essentially it depends. If you attacked into like terrain that causes you disorder and etc., you'll get the negative effects from it as well. But if they attacked you and you were in your sort of open ground terrain, in your fine terrain, you don't. So the idea is, you can imagine it's like if the person attacking essentially ran into the hex, well then that hex matters, the hex of the defender, so to speak. Now here you can see a practical example of this. So I'll let the enemy attack me, and then if you hover over the tip, you can see the line morale disorder modifier. Our unit severely disordered -45%. Enemy unit is also severely disordered -45%. Now they are actually in open ground, but again, because they attacked us, the hex that matter is the hex of the defender. So even though they're in open terrain, the effect will still stand. However, again, notice here, my unit is in the woods, so it's disordered, but if it's going to attack them, the enemy unit will remain steady, as you can see in the tooltip, because I'm the attacker, so again, the hex of the defender matters. So you can see here, we do get flank attacks, so that's good, but they're not disordered. So this is something to keep in mind. Alright, I think that's all you need to know about terrain. Let me know how you like this guide, or if you have any additional interesting tips around terrain, and write them down in the comments.